Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, you know, when we think about history and we think about the events that unfold, there's a lot of events that if we didn't have the benefit of all the years of hindsight, where we know how things played out and we know how decisions mattered in those instances, it would be easy to go back before those things happened and think to yourselves, you know, that's kind of a crazy idea, and I'm not entirely sure that I would think that would work. And, you know, for each of us, there are moments in history where we would think about that. And because we know things were successful, they don't seem so crazy. Or people had crazy ideas that failed, and we say that was a stupid idea. They never should have tried it. But there are so many times in history where before it actually worked, plenty of people thought that something was a crazy idea. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. We're going to take a look at the channel TopTenz. We're going all the way back 6 years ago when the channel was much more popular and still had Simon Whistler hosting it. And this is 10 crazy plans that actually worked. I'll put the link down in the description as always so you can check it out without my commentary. Check out all their other videos as well. And I want to thank Chris, great name by the way, in the Springs, Colorado Springs. Thank you so much, Chris. He just signed up just a couple of days ago as one of our top patrons now. So thank you so much for supporting the channel, Chris. Couldn't do this without you. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenz Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 crazy plans that actually worked. It's a staple of cheesy action movies and TV shows, a harebrained solution that is so outlandish that the protagonists just might pull it off. It's crazy enough to work, they'll always say. However, plans that seem wildly implausible but somehow manage to succeed don't only exist in the world of fiction. In the video today, 10 real-life crazy schemes, plans, and ideas that were just wacky enough to actually work.
So just thinking throughout history about crazy schemes that we look back on and think that was stupid. Why did they ever think that would work? Okay, so like Pykrete, you know, the idea that they were going to make things like aircraft carriers out of ice. Crazy, but we wouldn't think it was crazy if it actually worked. Plenty of examples like that. Let me know what yours are in the comment section below as we dive into this one.
Number 10. Sweeping up the cash. A group of French thieves found an enterprising way to clean out a chain of French supermarkets, literally. Due to the nature of their business, supermarkets tend to have a significant amount of cash on hand, and grocery store security protocols tend to be less stringent than other cash-heavy facilities, like, for example, banks. However, the larger supermarkets, those with a lot of money sitting around, still aren't easy targets for thieves. Generally, these stores employ some sort of vault to safeguard their cash until it can be picked up and taken to the bank, and for most thieves, breaking into a vault or safe quickly is a very difficult task. And here enters the vacuum gang, a group of...
First of all, this is a great point. You don't really hear about supermarkets being robbed. In fact, I can't, off the top of my head, think of an instance of it ever happening. I'm sure it has, but I can't think of one.
French thieves who figured out a novel way to rob cash from Monoprix grocery stores on more than a dozen occasions. In total, they walked away with hundreds of thousands of euros. Rather than breaking into the vault, the thieves targeted the pneumatic tube system that delivered envelopes of money from cashiers to the store's vault. By drilling a hole in the tube and then using a powerful vacuum, the thieves were able to sweep up the cash before it ever reached the vault, and then they walked away.
Okay, so the pneumatic tubes, if you've ever been to like a bank drive-thru, you know, when you send the thing and it goes shoop, and it goes up into the thing, that's what they're talking about. Holy cow. There had to have been some kind of inside knowledge here or something.
Being caught or identified. Number 9. Disguising...
And actually, he said hundreds of thousands, but let's go back and look at this. 600,000 euros in 15 robberies. I'm really curious to know if they ever got caught. I couldn't find a ton about this, but it looks like the thefts went from 2006 to 2010. And it was only in 2010 that a security camera caught them actually doing it. And that's when police actually figured out what they were doing to steal. And as far as I can tell, there were no more thefts after that, nor did they get caught. If anybody knows more information about this, let me know.
And then they walked away, never being caught or identified. Number 9. Disguising embassy personnel as a
Yes.
film crew to sneak them out of hostile territory.
There's a movie about
the
that.
next plan is so crazy that it sounds like the plot of a movie. And in fact, that movie would be Argo and is based on the true story of how the CIA, aided tremendously by the Canadian government, snuck 6 American consular officials out of Iran after the US embassy in Tehran was stormed. On November 4, 1979, the US embassy in Tehran was overrun by militant protesters. While more than 50 Americans working at the embassy were captured and held for more than a year during the infamous Iranian hostage crisis.
And if you want to know more about that whole scenario, just look at the run-up to the 1980 election between President Jimmy Carter and former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. This was one of the major sticking points of that election, and the release of the hostages actually was announced the day that Reagan took office.
5 Americans working at the embassy and 1 working as a nearby attaché were able to escape without being detected. After a few days of moving from house to house, the group turned to the Canadian embassy for help. The Canadians gave them shelter at the embassy and at the ambassador's personal residence, while the CIA developed a plan to try and get the 6 out of Iran. There were a lot of reasons to doubt that a safe exit from Iran would be possible for the Americans. The Iranians were employing carpet weavers to reconstruct files that contained photos of embassy staff members so that they might discover that some personnel were missing from their group of hostages at the time.
This is just in and of itself crazy to think about. They had shredded all this stuff. Imagine having the job of taking those shredded pieces of paper and recreating them, putting them all back together. Crazy stuff. The detail and the minutia and the amount of patience you would have to have for a job like that.
Time. Plausible cover stories for the group, for example, that they were English teachers, that they were working for an NGO, or that they were agricultural inspectors, were unworkable. English language schools had been shuttered, the Iranian government carefully monitored foreign NGO personnel, and crop inspections wouldn't occur during winter. So the CIA, specifically Tony Mendez, who was the authentication chief of the CIA's Graphics and Authentication Division, hatched an audacious plan to convince the Iranians the group was a Canadian film crew scouting locations for Argo, a sci-fi movie set in outer space. The plan required the CIA to set up a movie production office in LA, which they did, even taking meetings on other potential future projects.
Just the amount of thought that went into successfully pulling this off is incredible. All throughout history, but especially going back to like World War II, the complexity of some of these, let's call them scams, that were pulled off by governments and by world powers in order to achieve some goal of deception. Remarkable.
Generate publicity around the film's production. Hollywood Reporter and Variety published articles around the plans for the film and obtained Canadian passports that backed up their supposed plan.
All to get 6 people out. That's dedication.
Canadian law forbids falsification of identification documents, but the Canadian Parliament met in secret to approve the first exception since World War II.
Oh my gosh, you even had to get the Canadian Parliament to pass a law to make this possible. Wow.
In addition to procuring passports, the Canadians got copies of visa documents, established patterns of transit through the airport in Tehran, bought airline tickets, and coached the group in how to sound Canadian. Amazingly, this convoluted plan totally worked. The Iranian airport officials were fooled, the 6 Americans boarded the Swiss airplane that would take them out of danger, and once the plane was out of Iranian airspace, they celebrated with Bloody Marys. Number 8.
It was such a great story, and then you had to go ruin it with a drink like that. Ugh.
Figuring out how to beat Press Your Luck.
No
Many
whammies!
folks have dreamed of winning big on a game show. Michael Larson was one of them. However, unlike most people, Larson developed and executed a strategy that allowed him to rack up more than $110,000 in winnings on a single episode of Press Your Luck, which at the time, in 1984, was the largest haul by any daytime game show contestant in history. So how did Larson beat Press Your Luck? Well, to understand his victory, you need to understand a little about how the game worked. Contestants answered questions.
Great game. I remember this one a lot as a kid. This is the one where they would say like, big bucks, no whammies, and stop. And then you hit the thing.
And were awarded spins around a board of illuminated squares that offered cash, prizes, and additional spins, as well as whammies. Land on a whammy, which were placed on 1/6 of the rotating squares, and you would lose all your accumulated cash and prizes and end your turn. The team that built the board believed that the speed and random nature of the board would prevent any contestant from accruing more than $25,000, with most winners leaving with about $14,000. However, Larson, who had long been drawn to get-rich-quick schemes, had a lot of time on his hands to analyze episodes of Press Your Luck.
And there are certain people whose brains just work differently. 99.9% of the population can look at that and not see what that 0.1% can see, or even less in this case. And he just happened to see something and pick up on something and figure it out in a way that nobody else could.
After months of viewing the show during the winter, he was an ice cream man who didn't work in the off-season. Larson figured out the game's secret flaw. The squares weren't actually randomized. Instead, there were 5 looping patterns, which, with the help of a VCR and practice with his remote, he memorized. Larson then spent the last of his savings on a ticket to LA, where he successfully auditioned for the show. During the first half of the show, Larson didn't do well, perhaps on purpose, but during the second half, he found his footing. Larson spun 45 times in a row without hitting a whammy, passing his remaining spins when he feared he was losing focus. While show executives panicked about his improbable winning streak, they were helpless to stop it.
He hadn't done anything illegal or wrong. I mean, obviously they would have had to correct it after that, but you had to be thinking while they were filming this, they had to know something was up. They had to know that there was some reason. It couldn't have just been random.
Even after the show, they determined that he was entitled to his winnings because he had not broken any of the show's rules, just exploited a glitch in the board that no one else had noticed. Immediately after the episode, the board was retooled and contestant winnings were capped at $75,000, stopping any other players from taking the luck out of Press Your Luck. Number 7. Dazzling the enemy. It sounds like the exact opposite of how you should camouflage a military ship, by covering it with striking geometric patterns in bold, contrasting colors. But this Dazzle camouflage was used by the British and then by the US to protect their ships, primarily during World War I.
It doesn't make sense to us now in a world of radar, but when you're in a world of having to use visuals to spot the enemy and to get your range and things like that, it makes sense.
The idea behind Dazzle painting, proposed by British artist Norman Wilkinson, was to confuse German U-boat gunners by using the patterns to make it hard to quickly determine the ship's size, speed, or direction.
So all of that stuff, if you've ever played any games like with U-boats, where you have to use the computer that they would have at the time to calculate things, the first thing you have to know is you have to identify what the ship is, because then you can figure out how long it is, and then you know what its speeds are and things like that, and then it's easy to calculate its speed and direction and all that sort of stuff. So anything you can do to throw that off, it's, I guess, comparable to our stealth bombers today, which, because of their shapes, are able to throw off things like radar. Maybe not as much now, but it used to be that way. This was to throw off visuals in the same kind of purpose.
Because torpedoes were slow and expensive, a gunner generally only had one shot to hit his target, and an optical illusion that made him even slightly less precise could offer significant advantages to the target ship. During World War I, more than 4,000 British ships and 1,200 American ships were dazzled. The jury, though, is still out on whether dazzle painting was effective at thwarting enemy attacks. Academic studies at the time suggested that the designs could distort course estimates enough in order to elude torpedo attacks, and there is even some evidence suggesting that dazzled boats may have been struck more often but less effectively by the enemy during the war.
If it even gave you a 10 or 20% advantage that you didn't have before, it was worth it, right? I mean, if we're talking about precise calculations and a torpedo misses by 5 feet instead of hitting you, worth it.
Insurance companies believed it worked, lowering premiums for merchant vessels that had been dazzled. The British Admiralty concluded that dazzling probably didn't hurt or help, but noted the improvement on morale on dazzled ships versus non-dazzled ships was reason enough to keep the painting. Those ships were mostly painted over in more traditional grey when the war ended.
Yeah, sometimes it's just about confidence. If people have confidence, they're more likely to survive with the paint job. That in and of itself makes it worth it.
Number 6. Using a non-existent currency to bring inflation under control in Brazil. From the 1950s onwards, the Brazilian economy went through an inflationary period that caused turmoil within the country. By 1993, inflation had reached an incredible 2,000% a year. Brazilians would frantically rush to fill their fridges with food and their cars with gas as soon as they were paid, because prices would invariably be higher the next day and the day after that.
Now, that's not quite as bad as the stories that you hear about Germany in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, where people would get paid multiple times a day because by lunchtime the currency had devalued so much more that they had to get paid more. It's not quite that bad, but this is pretty dang close. I mean, think about the complaints, like here in America, for example, we're complaining about the amount of inflation we've had in the last couple of years, and it is nothing to the degree that even Brazil's dealing with here. And this has been sometimes used as a war measure. Back during the Revolutionary War here in what was then the colonies, the British actually used a tactic where they would flood the continent with fake paper currency to devalue the American currency. And guys were actually executed for that, including one of my ancestors was executed for being a counterfeiter.
Successive governments had failed to get inflation under control, and the Brazilian people lost faith not only in their government, but also in their currency. Finally, a new finance minister decided to call an economist for advice on how to rein in inflation. The economist, Edmar Bacher, and three of his longtime buddies from grad school proposed a plan that initially sounded crazy. In addition to reining in government spending, they also wanted to introduce a fake currency, which they called the URV, Unit of Real Value. The old currency would still exist, but all wages and prices would be listed in URVs. The only thing that would fluctuate is how many of the old currency a URV was worth.
Okay.
Even though there were no physical URVs, over the next few months, Brazilians, they came to trust that URV prices would remain steady. At that point...
this is actually a great point. I don't even know how much I'd argue this is necessarily fake currency. I mean, I guess technically it is, but sometimes when something spirals out of control like that, the same thing happened with the stock market crash in 1929 and the aftermath that leads to the Great Depression. A lot of what leads to the problems is how people respond to the problem. People panic, and so, for example, 100 years ago, people panicked and there was a run on the banks and everybody wanted to pull their money out of the banks. And by pulling all their money out of the banks, they made the problem significantly worse. So by restoring some level of confidence, you're actually stemming the problem that's continuing to spiral out of control. It actually makes a lot of sense.
The virtual currency became an actual currency known as the real. Inflation fell dramatically and Brazil's economy became much more stable. As one economist put it, Brazilians suddenly became capable of making plans for the future instead of having to live in the here and now.
100% about confidence and restoring consumer confidence in what's happening. That's why we actually have... Listen, I am not an economist. I don't know the first thing about that kind of stuff. But we actually have a marker that they measure, which is consumer confidence. That's a factor in how all this works.
Number 5, pretending to be mythical vampires to quell rebellion.
That's awesome.
From 1942 to 1954, the Hukbalahap rebellion, in which former soldiers rose up against the Philippine government, raged throughout the country. The CIA brought in Air Force Colonel Edward Lansdale to help assist the Philippine defense minister in subduing the rebels. Colonel Lansdale led a campaign focused on psychological warfare, including a plane that broadcast warnings from the voice of God. One of Lansdale's more inventive strategies involved exploiting local superstitions around the aswang, a terrifying mythical vampire that has been a staple of Filipino folklore for centuries.
This is actually brilliant because this shows you the importance of understanding the people that you're dealing with. When you understand the culture and the nature of the thought process, what their fears are, what they value, what they are concerned about, and you can work that into your strategy, brilliant stuff.
When a Hook rebel camp proved difficult to dislodge through conventional means, Lansdale's Combat Psychological Operations Squad was brought in. It began by spreading rumors amongst local villagers of an Aswang sighting. Then, as Lansdale recounts in his book, the Psy-War Squad set up an ambush along the trail used by the Hooks. When a Hook patrol came along the trail, the ambushers silently snatched the last man of the patrol, their move unseen in the dark night. They punctured his neck with 2 holes, vampire fashion, held the body up by the heels, drained it of blood, and put the corpse back on the trail. When the Hucks returned to look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the Aswang had got him, and that one of them would be next if they remained on that hill. When daylight came, the whole Huck squadron moved out of the vicinity.
This is so gutsy and so on the surface unbelievable. that again, it only works because of the culture that you're in, and it has to be pulled off in such a way that they don't figure out what you're doing. It's crazy to me that they even suggested this. Crazier still that they pulled it off.
While this is the only reported instance of American operatives impersonating vampires, local superstitions were also used during the Vietnam War when the US broadcast a recording called The Wailing Soul, in which spooky music overlaid a purported conversation between the wandering soul of a dead Vietnamese soldier and his daughter. Number 4. Escaping from prison in a helicopter. Joel David Kaplan, a businessman from a wealthy New York family, found himself in a precarious position. Despite substantial irregularities in the evidence, he was convicted of killing his business partner and sentenced to 28 years in a Mexican prison. After his appeals were denied, Kaplan, who maintained his innocence throughout, knew that his only chance of getting out was to escape. Several unsuccessful escape plans were attempted, trying to escape en route to the hospital after feigning illness, having a tunnel dug to provide a route out of the prison, sneaking out in a disguise, and hiding inside one of the truck compartments that were manufactured on site at the prison.
So here in the United States, if you had attempted any of those things, you would end up in what we call a supermax prison. We have one just a few miles from where I live. These are the ones where you're basically in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. I mean, it is an absolutely horrible way to live. And it's the worst of the worst who end up in situations like that, or people that have a history of escape. Gosh.
In the end, the escape plan that got Kaplan out of prison seemed like the most far-fetched scheme of all. Kaplan, along with another prisoner, escaped by helicopter. While most of the prisoners and guards were occupied watching a movie, the chopper touched down in the prison yard, and Kaplan and his fellow prisoner just ran out, grabbed on, and flew away without even triggering an alarm.
So they just got some dude to land a helicopter in the prison? Wow.
The helicopter took them to a nearby plane, on which Kaplan and his pilot flew across the border into Texas and presented themselves to U.S. customs officials. The best part of the plan is that since escaping from jail is not a crime in Mexico and the two men were honest with U.S. customs about their identities, there were no crimes committed in the eyes of the U.S. government.
And there you go. So he didn't break any laws by apparently breaking out of prison is not a thing for which you get additionally punished. Wow. It was smart how they played that, though, by immediately turning themselves into American officials when they got here.
U.S. authorities showed little interest in extraditing Kaplan, who was rumored to have been working with the CIA on the basis of his dubious murder conviction, so after his crazy escape, he was free to go. Kaplan's helicopter-assisted jailbreak was the first of its kind, but many other attempts have followed with mixed success.
Wow.
Number 3. Using lunar gravity, duct
Apollo
tape, and
13.
a sock to get astronauts back to Earth alive. Houston, we've had a problem. Those iconic words spoken by astronaut Jim Lovell, the bald...
Now, notice he didn't say, Houston, we have a problem. Because that's not what they said. And I think it was said by two of the guys. Like, it was said once, and then Houston, Mission Control in Houston said, like, asked them, they didn't copy or didn't hear it. And I think it was then that Lovell actually said it. And in the movie, you have Kevin Bacon and then Tom Hanks, I think, both kind of saying a version of it.
The Apollo 13 moon mission marked the beginning of a frantic effort to get the 3-man crew aboard the shuttle back to Earth safely after one of the ship's oxygen tanks exploded and 2 of the spacecraft's 3 fuel cells were lost.
We take for granted how fairly successful these Apollo missions were that went to the moon. But when you think about the technology that was being used at the time and how this is like legit 65 years after the first powered flight that were putting people on the moon, 66 years, I guess. It's remarkable we didn't have more things like this happen. And it's more remarkable still that these guys managed to get home when they were basically flying around in a capsule that is half the size of my bedroom and had an explosion on it while they're hundreds of thousands of miles in the middle of a hundreds of thousands of miles trip.
The crew quickly moved to the tiny lunar module to preserve electrical energy, while NASA personnel on the ground devised plans to keep the 3 men alive for 4 days in a lunar module that had been designed to support 2 men for 2 days. The most pressing problem was developing a way to remove carbon dioxide from the module. Square canisters of lithium hydroxide could clean the air, but they wouldn't fit into the round openings on the lunar module. Mission Control devised a workaround to get the canisters to fit using materials on board the module, including an instruction book, a piece of plastic gum, garment bag, a tube sock, and duct tape. The other key problem was getting the spacecraft back to Earth with the fuel that remained. Mission Control directed the astronauts on a precise firing of the spacecraft's engines in order to use lunar gravity to slingshot the craft around the moon and get in a return trajectory. On April 17, 1970, the crew safely returned to Earth, and a jubilant nation celebrated the ingenuity and tenacity that allowed the astronauts to make it home in one piece.
The Apollo 13 mission, and if you haven't seen the movie, definitely watch it. It's a phenomenal look at what people are capable of when you get the best people in the best positions and you put them in a horrible situation that could easily result in death. And they pulled this off. It's absolutely astounding that they pulled this off and got these guys home in one piece.
Number 2. Holding back the sea. It sounds like a recipe for disaster, having one of the world's most densely populated countries situated largely on a low-lying floodplain right next to the ocean. Oh, and also add to that the fact that the land is crisscrossed by rivers. However, despite serious floods in its history, the Netherlands has largely succeeded in using an elaborate system of canals, dikes, and reservoirs to hold back the sea.
It's another one of those things that, in today's day and age makes sense, but to look at the fact that over hundreds of years they developed these systems and they basically made land that wasn't really livable into livable space. And you look at, there's even cities like New Orleans, for example. It's just in New Orleans, and it's below sea level, and it's got a huge lake, Lake Pontchartrain on one side, and the Mississippi River on the other side, and it sits down in a bowl between them. And you walk along the sidewalks, and the sidewalks are all like they're not straight, and that's because they're constantly draining the water out from below the soil, and it causes the sidewalks to not sit straight. Just man is able to achieve remarkable things when he puts his mind toward it in a concerted effort.
Early Dutch settlers relied on dikes to protect them from the sea and rivers, and then windmills were constructed to power drainage ditches and canals to make the land suitable for agriculture and safe for habitation. Today, Dutch flood management has become much more sophisticated, incorporating storm surge barriers such as the Meeslantkering, a giant set of floating doors in the waterway that connects the North Sea to the port city of Rotterdam. If a storm surge of more than 3 meters is anticipated, the doors automatically shut to protect Rotterdam's harbour and the surrounding towns. The national government has also worked to reclaim fields and canals in order to serve as reservoirs in the event of a flood and as usable public space during other times. As Rotterdam's climate chief explained, for the Dutch, finding strategies to deal with the water that surrounds the country has long been a top priority.
Every country has its unique challenges, but there are a few that are as unique as an entire country that has to constantly be thinking about how to keep itself from flooding because of the nature of the terrain and its location.
He said, "It's not just a bunch of dikes and dams, but it's a way of life."
It is totally a way of life
1,
there.
Facilitating kidney
And
swap.
I have to just say, just as an aside, great country. I've only been there once, but had a wonderful time. Some of my friends that I spend a lot of time in Europe with are from the Netherlands, and they're great as well.
Donating an organ to someone who needs it to survive is quite literally giving the gift of life, and it's a gift many are waiting for. As of 2016 in the United States, more than 120,000 people were on the wait list for an organ transplant, with more than 100,000 of them waiting for a kidney transplant. Unfortunately, there just aren't enough kidneys for all of those who need them. In 2014, only about 17,000 donor kidneys, about 11,500 from deceased donors, were available in the US, and more than 8,000 people who were waiting for a kidney either died or became too sick for a transplant while they waited. Many patients suffering have friends or family members who are willing to donate a kidney to them, and in the US, about 1/3 of transplanted kidneys come from living donors. But sometimes, about 1/3 of the time, the willing friend or family member isn't a match. This used to stop the process. The recipients would have to continue waiting for a kidney from a deceased donor, which isn't ideal, both because of the delays inherent in the waitlist, as well as the fact that kidneys from living donors last almost twice as long after transplant. In 1991, South Korean doctors began solving this problem through a strategy that sounds a little off the wall at first. They were facilitating kidney swaps. It goes like this. Patient A's loved one, who was not a match with patient A but was a match with patient B, would donate their kidney to patient B. And patient B's loved one, who matched patient A but not patient B, would donate to patient A. While this was a big step forward, it still left some people out, as a match was needed on both sides. A computer matching program was created in order to make domino chains of kidney donations, an even more audacious undertaking. An altruistic donor, unrelated to any recipient, kicks off the chain by donating a kidney, and a series of matched donations from loved ones to unrelated recipients ensues, ending with a final recipient who lacks a willing living donor. In 2012, a chain involving 60 surgeries over 5 months resulted in 30 kidney transplants across the United States. In 2015, an even larger chain resulted in 34 successful kidney transplants, setting a new record.
So all of this is to say, again, that when we put our mind to it, we can get creative with this stuff. And this took a problem where I want to donate my kidney to my sister, say, but I'm not a match to her. But somebody way down the line, somewhere else in California, for example, is a match to her. By me donating my kidney to someone, it kind of pushes her up the list. My sister up the list to where she can get the kidney she needs a little quicker, even though I'm not directly giving it to her.
By allowing living donors to trade their kidneys to secure one for a loved one, the domino effect allows more lives to be saved, both by increasing the number of living donors who are able to help a loved one in need.
This is about motivation. This is about incentivizing. So, I'm willing to give my kidney, but it wouldn't help my sister. That might have been the end of the process. And now I'm no longer willing to give my kidney because I won't give it to a stranger. But because I'm willing to give my kidney to a stranger, that increases the likelihood that there's going to be a stranger that will give their kidney to my sister. So it all makes sense when you kind of think about it big picture. It's really brilliant. It's kind of a marketing thing if you think about it.
And by reducing the pool of people on the wait list for a kidney from a deceased donor. So I really hope you found that video interesting.
Yeah, so that was pretty interesting stuff. So as I said at the beginning, if you have a particular one that you think should be added to this conversation, some idea that probably before it actually worked really seemed nuts to a lot of people, let me know in the comment section below. I want to thank Wyatt in Bardonia, New York, and Josh in Monroe, Michigan, the adopted home of George Armstrong Custer, who was born in New Rumley, which is 45 minutes or so from me here in Northeast Ohio. Thank you both, Wyatt and Josh, for your support on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Check out some of these other videos while you wait for tomorrow's. Thanks for watching.